Hi and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about emphasizing important information or techniques that you can use to help you emphasize the most important information that you want to share in your document. So let's start with writing clear, informative titles. Your title is really your first chance to define your subject and purpose for your readers. And your title should always include both a subject and a purpose. So for example, the title Snowboard Injuries is not as informative as something like How to Prevent Snowboard Injuries. With How to Prevent Snowboard Injuries, we see the subject, what it's about, snowboard injuries, and the purpose of the information, which is to prevent those injuries. So an effective title is also precise. You don't want it to be too long, but it does need to have enough information that it communicates what you are trying to say. So make sure that it's not verbose or redundant or anything like that, but also don't be afraid of making your title long. And then my suggestion is to write your title last. As you are creating your document, its subject and its purpose might evolve or might change. So it's a good idea to come up with like a working title, but then always go back and edit it at the end to make sure that you have the best title possible for what you've created. You also want clear headings. Just like you want clear titles, clear headings are important. Headings are lower level titles for sections and subsections in your documents. A lot of times in like academic essays, you don't necessarily see headings, but in technical documents or business related documents, you will often see headings or subheadings. So usually there's going to be like a primary section that has the most general information, but also a lot of times there's secondary sections or subsections with more specific information. So label these, give them titles for these sections or subsections. And the same rules that apply to giving your document a title apply to giving your sections or subsections a title. You want clear and informative headings that communicate not only what the section is about, but how it relates to the rest of the content in your document. And you also want to make sure that your section headings and subsection headings are clearly distinguishable. There's several ways to do this in whatever word processing program you are using. Word is probably the easiest for me because it's what I'm most familiar with, but even in Google Docs, you can go in and make something heading level 1, heading level 2, that sort of thing. Just make sure that there's some consistency in your documents and it's easy for your reader to see. So here's an example of what some headings might look like. And then if I were creating these headings, I would use this formatting throughout the entire document. So every level 1 heading would look like that. Every level 2 heading would look like that. And every level 3 heading would look like the level 3 heading that I have here. Be consistent. Whatever design choice you make for your headings, it needs to be consistent throughout your entire document. A lot of times headings are a type of title, so the same advice that we kind of talked about with titles apply to headings. It's generally a good idea for your heading to contain a subject and a purpose. So let's talk about how to come up with an effective heading. Avoid long noun strings. They're just kind of confusing. Something like proposed production enhancement strategies, analysis techniques. That's difficult to quickly ascertain the meaning of. But something like techniques for analyzing the proposed strategies for enhancing production, when it starts with a verb, it's just a little bit easier for our brains to figure out quickly, oh, okay, this is what this section is going to be about. You want to be informative, like 3 techniques for analyzing the proposed strategy for enhancing productions. This one is a little bit better than the heading in front of it because I know immediately going into this section, okay, there's going to be 3 techniques that we're going to be talking about in this section. Or maybe even better yet, advantages and disadvantages of the 3 techniques for analyzing the proposed strategies for enhancing production. Again, don't worry if the heading seems long. Clarity is more important than being concise here. And when I read this title, I know specifically that there are going to be 3 techniques in this section that are discussed. I know what those techniques are going to be for, and I know that we're going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of each of those techniques. So knowing all of that information going into that section of my document is going to give the reader a good grasp on what we're talking about, the ability to sort of pace themselves appropriately, and some foreknowledge about what to expect. So you always want to use grammatical form that is appropriate for your audience when you are writing headings. Now, whether or not you're writing for native English speakers or not native English speakers, or if you're writing in another language, that is going to affect the grammatical form that you are using. Sometimes things work better in questions. In other languages, they don't structure questions quite the same way that English does. So really think about who is your target audience, who is reading it, and what is going to be the best grammatical form appropriate for your audience. A lot of times if we're writing instructional materials such as manuals, we use like the how-to form, which is basically like how to analyze the proposed strategies for enhancing production. And then you also have the gerund form, which is just adding that ing to the verb. This works well if we're discussing something or if we're going to give a long description of a process. So for example, instead of how to analyze, we might say analyzing the proposed strategies. So if I read a title that said how to analyze, I would assume that this is going to be kind of step-by-step instructions, whereas analyzing the proposed strategy, I assume that this is going to be a more in-depth description of the process or a discussion about the process. You can also use clear, informative lists in your documents, and this is a great way to emphasize important information. We're going to talk about a couple of different types of lists, but one of the things that makes lists so effective is that you can very quickly pull a lot of information together in one spot and have your reader understand succinctly what you are trying to communicate. Now, let's talk about different kinds of lists. So the first one up here is paragraph list. These are lists in which the bulletin or number items are paragraphs. So a lot of times this is represented this way because it's kind of easier to read and remember. Usually paragraph lists start with a 1 or a 2-word summary of the paragraph, but they are definitely the most involved type of list. They have the most text. Up next is going to be sentence list. These are lists in which the bullets or the numbered items are word phrases or single sentences. Usually sentence lists start with a phrase that's connected to every item on the list. You also can look at your list and figure out how should I best break up this. If you have a really long list, sometimes it's better to divide it into subsections, just like you would divide your document into different sections. So for example, you can see here on the left, there's a list of things that might appear in a toolkit. This can be overwhelming to look at. There's quite a few items on that list. You know, you might kind of get lost looking at it, but we can see over on the right, the list has been revised. It still says toolkit and it has the same items, but it's been divided into the subsections of saws and wrenches, and it's a little bit easier to take that information in quickly. Make sure that when you are writing lists that you're using parallel grammatical form. So for example, the list on the left is not parallel. So we can see that there's different verb tenses, different structures in how it's done. We have writing and then do, and then interviewed, and then the next one doesn't even have a verb at all, so it's just kind of all over the place. Now, could we ascertain the meaning from this list? Yeah, probably. We can understand what the author is saying, but it doesn't work as well as if we put it in parallel grammatical form. So we can see the list on the right is in parallel form, and all of these have verbs that are in present tense. Write the preliminary proposal, do the library research, interview the vice president, write a first draft, revise the first draft, and prepare the final draft. So we can see that the way all of these match grammatically, it kind of helps our brains to process this information. One of the things that's important about writing technical documents is you want to be able to communicate your information as clearly as possible to as many different people. It's also important to punctuate the list correctly. If the items are phrases, a lot of times the list will start with a lowercase letter, and they don't use a period or a comma at the end. But if the items on the list are complete sentences, you're going to use an uppercase letter at the beginning and a period at the end. The same rules that you would use for sentences anywhere else in writing, you're going to use in lists. If the items are followed by a complete sentence, then you're going to go ahead and start each phrase with an uppercase letter and end it with a period. Sometimes you'll see on lists people will use like italics to emphasize the phrases that come before. And if your list contains a mix of both phrases and complete sentences, then go with the sentence rule about capitalizing the beginning and ending with a period or other punctuation mark. In the body sections of your document, where you will have paragraphs, it is important to write clear, informative paragraphs. Every paragraph is going to be to start with a topic sentence. All of your paragraphs will follow the same sort of format or structure, and this will help your reader process your information. So you start with a topic sentence. Your topic sentence should state or summarize or forecast the main point of your paragraph. What is your paragraph going to be doing? Don't bury bad news in paragraphs. If you have bad news to share, you want to do it at the very beginning of the paragraph, not kind of 7 or 8 sentences in. The truth is that when presented with a 10-sentence paragraph, most of us are going to skim. Even if it's a document for work, you don't want somebody to miss something. So start with the main point of your paragraph. Then is when you go in and add all of your supporting information. So this can include definitions, illustrations or examples, causes or factors or explanations about what's going on in the topic sentence. It can define effects or implications of what is going on in the topic sentence, or just support for whatever claim you made in the topic sentence. So let's talk about how long to make your paragraphs. Technical writing is a little bit different than academic writing, but a good general rule of technical writing is that about 5 to 10 sentences makes a good paragraph. If your paragraph is longer than that, see if you can divide it into smaller paragraphs, but make sure that you're breaking up the paragraphs at a logical place and that each paragraph starts with a topic sentence and then is supported with information. If you have sort of too much information, or it's all connected and you can't break it into separate paragraphs, you might look at if using a list is appropriate. It may not be appropriate in academic writing, which is probably what you're most familiar with at this point, but usually it works just fine in technical or business writing. Now let's talk about how you use transitions, keywords, and pronouns. So, transitions. Transitions are words or phrases that connect sentences, paragraphs, topics, ideas, that sort of thing. So you're going to use transitional sentences to connect paragraphs. Why are you switching from one topic to the next? Explain it to your reader, even if you feel like it should be obvious. This helps your document feel like it flows. And then you're going to use transitional words to connect sentences. Up next is keywords. Sometimes when we think in terms of like academic writing, we want our writing to feel fresh and varied, so we will use a lot of synonyms. You're not going to do that in technical or business writing. Repeat your keywords, especially your nouns. This helps your reader follow the discussion. So for the example I have here is maybe we're talking about a doctor in a document. If I'm writing an academic essay or creative writing or something like that, maybe I want to switch it up to be interesting. Don't do that in technical writing. Doctor is always doctor. If it's a doctor, it's not a medical professional, it's not a healthcare provider, it's not any of those things. We're going to be consistent with our keywords and terms. And then pronouns. So here's the thing about pronouns. Pronouns tend to be much less clear than writers anticipate. Obviously, you know what you're talking about, but a lot of times your reader doesn't. So here's the rule about pronouns. If you are going to use a pronoun, she, her, they, it, something like that, you must use the identifying word in the same sentence. Not in the sentence before, not in the sentence after. It needs to come in that sentence. Dr. Smith was concerned about the diagnosis, semicolon. She was very worried, right? I can say she in that sentence because I started with the identifying word, Dr. Smith, right? That's who she represents. But I couldn't say Dr. Smith was very concerned about Samantha's diagnosis. She was very worried. Well, who was worried? We don't really know. Was it Samantha? Was it Dr. Smith? What's happening here? So just be very careful when you use pronouns. If you have questions about any of the stuff that we talked about today, make sure that you reach out to me. Otherwise, good work and keep on trucking.